You had already decided. Not impulsively, you had thought it through, weighed it up, and arrived somewhere that felt right. It felt solid. You moved forward with it, maybe even told someone about it, and for a little while there was no question in your mind that you had made the right call. Then something small happened. A comment that wasn't quite a criticism. A pause in a conversation that lasted just a little too long. A moment where someone's expression didn't quite match what you expected. Nothing was said directly. Nothing was confirmed. But something shifted, quietly, without announcement, and the certainty you had was suddenly harder to find. You went back over the decision. Not because new information had appeared, but because the feeling of being sure had gone. And without that feeling, the decision itself started to look different. Less clear. Less obviously right. You began to wonder if you had missed something, if you had moved too quickly, if the confidence you felt earlier was actually just a failure to see the full picture. This is how self-doubt often begins. Not with a dramatic collapse, not with clear evidence that something has gone wrong. Just a small crack in the feeling of certainty, and then the slow, quiet process of that crack spreading. The strange thing is that nothing on the outside has changed. The decision is the same decision. The reasons behind it are the same reasons. But the internal ground it was standing on has shifted, and now the whole thing feels less stable than it did before. The mind starts looking for proof that it was right, and somehow, the searching itself makes everything feel less certain. Self-doubt doesn't usually arrive as a loud accusation. It arrives as a question. A soft, reasonable-sounding question that didn't exist an hour ago. And once it arrives, it tends to bring more questions with it, each one quieter than the last, but somehow harder to dismiss. By the time it has settled in, it no longer feels like doubt. It feels like clarity. Like you are finally seeing things as they really are. That is perhaps the most disorienting thing about it. It doesn't feel like the mind turning against itself. It feels like the mind waking up. Carl Jung understood that the mind is never just one thing. Beneath the surface of the person who feels confident, who makes decisions and moves forward, there are other parts, older, quieter, less visible, that don't always agree. Jung called the unknown parts of ourselves the shadow. Not something dark or dangerous in a dramatic sense, but simply the parts we haven't fully looked at. The parts that carry old fears, old wounds, old beliefs about what we are and aren't capable of. Jung noticed that the shadow doesn't disappear just because we stop looking at it. It waits. And it often chooses its moments carefully, appearing not when things are going badly, but when things are going well. When a person feels certain, when they have made a decision and moved forward with confidence, that is sometimes exactly when the shadow stirs. Because confidence, to the unexamined parts of the self, can feel like a threat. Like a claim being made that hasn't been earned yet. Self-doubt, seen through Jung's eyes, is often the shadow speaking. Not loudly, not clearly, but through feeling. Through that sudden loss of solid ground. Through the creeping sense that maybe you were wrong, maybe you missed something, maybe the confidence you felt was never really justified. The shadow doesn't offer evidence. It doesn't need to. It simply introduces a feeling of uncertainty and lets the conscious mind do the rest. Jung would have pointed to something important here. The doubt that arrives after a good decision is rarely about the decision itself. It is about the parts of the self that weren't included in it. The inner voices that didn't get a say. The older, quieter beliefs that were still there beneath the surface, about worthiness, about capability, about whether someone like you is really allowed to feel that certain about anything. What looks like honest reassessment is often, in Jung's framework, the psyche pulling itself back towards something more familiar. Certainty feels exposed. Doubt feels safer. And the shadow, which has lived in the quieter, more cautious parts of the self for a long time, knows exactly how to make uncertainty feel like wisdom. The mind doesn't experience this as conflict. It experiences it as second thoughts, as maturity, as finally being realistic. But underneath, something older is simply refusing to let the newer, more confident self stand on ground it hasn't fully claimed yet. Friedrich Nietzsche was deeply interested in what people do with their own strength. He watched how people build themselves up, through effort, through decision, through the quiet courage of moving forward, and then, just as quietly, tear themselves back down. Not because someone else attacked them. Because something inside them did. Nietzsche wrote about values, the standards a person holds for themselves, the invisible rules that govern what feels acceptable and what doesn't. These values are not neutral. They have weight. And when a person acts in a way that brushes against them, even slightly, even unconsciously, the inner judge wakes up. Not always with a clear accusation. Sometimes just with a feeling. A coolness. A withdrawal of the warmth that confidence used to carry. Self-doubt, in Nietzsche's world, is often what happens when a person's actions outpace their inner permission to succeed. When they have moved further forward than some deep, unexamined part of them believes they are allowed to go. The decision was made. The step was taken. But the inner judge, that voice built from years of absorbed expectations, comparisons, and inherited ideas about limitation, looks at what has been done and quietly withholds its approval. And without that approval, certainty starts to feel like arrogance. Confidence starts to feel like a mistake waiting to happen. The mind begins to soften what it was sure about, not because the facts have changed, but because the inner judge has decided that being too sure is itself a kind of danger. That certainty invites failure. That it is safer, wiser, more honest to doubt. Nietzsche would have recognized this pattern as one of the quieter forms of self-betrayal. The person who doubts their own good decision is not being careful. They are being obedient to a standard they absorbed somewhere along the way that tells them their judgment cannot fully be trusted. That there is always something they missed. That the confidence they felt was probably premature. He would have called this a failure of will. Not weakness in the ordinary sense, but the specific failure of a person turning their own values into a cage. Using the very thing that was supposed to drive them forward as a reason to pull back. The inner judge doesn't need evidence. It just needs the moment when your guard is down. When you were certain, and now, suddenly, you are not so sure anymore. Søren Kierkegaard spent much of his life thinking about one question: what does it mean to be a self? Not in an abstract sense, but in the most ordinary, daily sense. The self that wakes up in the morning and has to decide things. The self that moves forward and then looks back. The self that, in quiet moments, is not always sure it knows what it is or whether it can trust what it feels. Kierkegaard understood that doubt is not always a problem to be solved. Sometimes it is a condition, a permanent feature of being a person who is alive and unfinished and always in the middle of becoming something. He wrote about anxiety not as a disorder but as the natural feeling of standing at the edge of your own freedom. Of knowing that you could go one way or another, and that the choice is yours, and that there is no guarantee attached to any of it. Self-doubt, for Kierkegaard, lives exactly in that space. The moment after a decision is made, when the freedom that felt so clear before has now become a weight. When you chose, and the choosing itself opened up the question of whether you chose correctly. He saw this not as failure but as the unavoidable cost of being someone who takes their own life seriously. People who never doubt, he suggested, are often people who have stopped paying attention. But Kierkegaard also noticed something quieter and more uncomfortable. That doubt, when it is not moved through, becomes a place to live. That the mind can settle into uncertainty the way it settles into anything familiar, and begin to prefer it. Because certainty requires commitment. It requires standing behind something without a guarantee. And that is frightening in a way that doubt never is, because doubt always leaves the door open. Always keeps the escape route clear. He would have looked at the person who had been certain and then wasn't, and he would have asked a simple question. Not, was your decision right? But, do you trust yourself enough to stand behind it anyway? Not because you are certain, but because you are willing to be the person who decided. For Kierkegaard, the disappearance of certainty was never really about the decision. It was always about the relationship between a person and themselves. Whether they could hold their own ground when the feeling of sureness had gone. Whether they could remain themselves, committed, present, willing, even when the mind had quietly started to pull the floor away. That, he believed, was not a question of confidence. It was a question of faith in oneself. And it was one of the hardest questions a person could face.